Okay, welcome back, and this is the last part 10 in the screencast tutorial series for Parallax setup using Photoshop and Blender. I'll start off by apologizing. I'm not feeling well at the time of this recording, so hopefully that won't interfere too much. Okay, so in part 9 we did the setup for animating our subject. Again, this is not the best photo, and I realize that now. This is not the best photo for animating the kid. What I'm going to do is very simply is I'm going to animate his right arm, and I'm going to animate his head tilting a little bit. So if I were to do this all over again, I would certainly look out for a photograph and be thinking about what would the subject be doing if they're animating. I reanimated my camera. You'll see if I select my camera here. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so my camera is just moving from a downward position upward. You can see over here on the right hand side. We're looking at the boy's feet. We get the parallax effect. It's nice. And then we end on seeing the boy's upper body here. So, okay, so we need to select the kid, and in the last video we went into edit mode and we subdivided the mesh so we had more vertices and edges and faces and geometry in general so that we can manipulate the mesh now and animate him. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press numpad 3, and that's going to get me a nice view on the kid here so I can animate him. For you it might be numpad 1, which is front view, or numpad 3 like me, which is actually technically side view. Okay, so I'm focusing in on the kid. So here's how you do it. So first of all, you need to tab into edit mode, and again, hopefully you can see this on my screen, but you can see all these dark black vertices. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be selecting vertices, or verts, and then we'll be making changes. We'll be using the add-on called Animal, and we'll be inserting keyframes, and I'll show you how that works. So to do this, so on frame 1, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to animate his head first. So I'm going to zoom in on his head. So the first thing I can do is on frame 1 I want his head to be just like this. And on frame, my last frame, I changed my animation to be a little shorter so it wouldn't take as long to render. So my last frame right now is 120. So on frame 120 I want his head tilted to the right a little bit. So what I'm going to do is if I go ahead and I right click and I select a single vertex, if I grab that vertex, you'll see that it moves the image around and it kind of smears the image in a weird way. If I go ahead and I select multiple vertices, let's say I just go around selecting them, and I grab those, G, you'll see the image being manipulated here. So it looks very strange here. So how do we make it look more normal? Well, what we want to do is we want to turn on something called proportional editing. And it's down here at the bottom of the 3D window. The shortcut key is the letter O. And so it's right down here where my mouse pointer is. If I press O, you'll see that it turns on. You'll see that it becomes blue and it turns in color. If you press O again, it turns off. So all you need to do is activate it. And yeah, there are different kinds of settings down here that you can click on and change it. But for this tutorial, just turn it on. Just O to turn it on. Now the way this works is that if I select a vertex inside the middle of his head and I press G to grab to grab the vertex. Now, let me zoom out so you can see it. Now you'll see that there's a circle going around my mouse cursor. And what that circle is it's called the area of influence. And basically it means that all the vertices that are inside that circle are going to be influenced. They're going to be affected. Okay, so it's the circle of influence. So anything that's inside that circle is going to get affected. So you see that if I grab, the entire body of the kid is being moved around because it's all inside the circle. Well, how do I change the circle of influence? If you use your scroll wheel, you'll see that it will make the circle of influence bigger or smaller. So if I scroll forwards, I'm making the circle of influence smaller. Now you'll see that only his upper body, and of course this is kind of ridiculous what I'm doing right here, you'll see that only the upper body is influenced because the circle of influence is smaller. And again, if I make it even smaller, it influences an even tinier area. So I'm going to press escape to get out of that. You can always press escape anytime you want. And I'm going to zoom in on his head. And if I press G to grab, and I'm going to reduce the circle of influence, you can see that I can influence just his head and his neck area. Okay? So now that we know about, and that's what proportional editing does, is it lets you select just a few vertices, but it lets you edit proportionally other vertices, so you don't have to select them all. And animators use this to give them very natural animation. So Pixar uses this, for instance, to select a few vertices on a character's face and move their cheeks up and down or their eyebrows up and down so that they get this very natural, muscular, fleshy movement. So here's how we're going to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select a few vertices here in the middle of the head. So I'm going to press A to deselect all. I'm now going to do what's called circle select, and in class we did this a long time ago, so you may have forgotten, but I'm going to press C to circle select. And when you circle select, you get another circle around your mouse cursor, and you can change the size of that circle select. It's kind of like changing the size of a brush, and the bigger it is, the more vertices you'll select. And you can now left click and brush over, and you can very quickly select a bunch of verts on the kid's head. Now, if you need to deselect any of these, you can hold down the mouse wheel, and you can just hold down the mouse wheel and you can deselect. So left click, I'm going to select, and I'm just going to kind of select the center vertices around his head. Now to get out of circle select mode, you would press escape. Okay? Alright, so now that I've got a bunch selected here, if I press G to grab, you'll see that I get a pretty decent grab of his head here. Okay? So this is where a little trial and error is going to come in. You might have to select more vertices to move it, but I'm going to try this first. Okay, so now I'm ready to animate. His head is going to stay like this with no change right here on frame 1. So I'm going to put in a keyframe here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, and on the left hand side I'm going to click on the animation tab. So if you're on any other tab like this, here's the tool tab. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to click on animation tab. And up here in the top you'll see where it says Animal, and that's the add-on that we installed the last video. So all you need to do is you just need to activate one checkbox here, and that's the points checkbox. And it's basically telling Blender that we're going to be animating the points, or the vertices, it probably should say verts, using this add-on. So all you need to do is activate points. So we want to insert a keyframe on frame 1, and the way we do that is we just click on Insert. And what you'll see is down here in the dope sheet editor, as you'll see right down here is it says kid, and I'm going to go ahead and collapse that, just close it so it's a little easier for your eyes to see. So you can see that there is now a keyframe on frame 1 for the vertices of the kid's head. Okay, so now I'm going to do a very simple keyframe change. I'm going to do a second keyframe. I'm going to go to my last frame, and that happens to be frame 120. Yours is probably going to be frame 240, like the last video. Okay, so now I want to tilt his head to the right, and I'm only going to do a small movement. If you go too far, it's going to be too extreme, it's going to stretch and distort, and that's really what you want to avoid here. Okay, so now I need to rotate his head. So I could press G and grab his head and move it, but that's going to be distorted. So what I want to probably do is probably press R to rotate his head. And you can see I can rotate his head just a little bit, again watching for distortion. So I can rotate it a little bit and left click to accept, and then press G to grab, and maybe then grab it a little bit and move it to the right a little bit. So I can do that. And you can see that the vertices are, tilting and distorted a little bit. But his head looks pretty good. It's not very distorted. I'm going to undo that twice. There we go. So that looked pretty good. And I could keyframe that by coming up here and clicking on Insert. So I'll go ahead and let me do that one more time to show you again. So R to rotate. I rotate his head a little bit to get a little bit of the angle I want. Very subtle. Left click to accept. Then you can see his neck is kind of bunching up over here and his shirt collar's bunching up. So watch that. Then press G and just bring it back down here to the right a little bit so his neck collar and shoulder aren't doing anything weird. Okay, so let's say I'm going to insert that keyframe. So just click on Insert, and now you'll see that there's a second keyframe down here. Okay, so I'm going to tab out, and you can see the mesh stretching a little bit, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so here's my camera view, and I'm going to press play, and let's just see what that is. Okay, so there's my camera view, so watch on the right. So press play. And if you notice it, you can see towards the end there his head is moving. It's very subtle. On the left you can see his head moving throughout the whole animation, but because the camera's moving, you really only see it. It's really, really, really subtle. Now of course, if I really wanted the animation on his head to be much more noticeable, maybe I would change my camera animation. Maybe my camera animation would go slower. Maybe there would be no camera animation at all and I would just see the boy moving. So now's the time where you as a director and as an artist need to make these kinds of decisions. But this video is mostly about how to animate your subjects. So I'm going to show you one more thing and then we'll finish up. I'm going to go to frame 120 and I'm going to delete that last keyframe that I made. So remember in our last video how to, or in the 2 videos ago, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press A to deselect all keyframes, and I'm going to right mouse click on my last keyframe for the kid, and I'm going to delete that. I'm going to press X and say delete, and you'll see that his head tilt goes back. So that's really nice. It's almost like you can't make any mistakes really. Okay, and I'm going to animate this in a little bit of a different way just to show you how you can get more control as an animator. Okay, so I'm going to press tab and enter edit mode, and I've still got the same vertices selected. I'm on frame 120. So now what I want to do is I still want to do a head tilt. But this time I want to throw in a little bit of extra control. So watch this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change something called a pivot point. Right now the pivot point is right here in the center of the selected vertices, and you can see it's right here. So when I rotate his head, you can see it's rotating from the center of those selected vertices. If I were to scale, which will look silly, you can see it's scaling from the center of those selected vertices. So it's right here where you see my mouse pointer. when you think about how the head rotates and moves, it really moves from the neck. And that's how we're designed as human beings. So what I want to do is I want to rotate from the neck, so we actually get like a real head tilt. So here's how you can do that. It's really cool. So you're going to come down here to the bottom of the 3D window, and you're going to see this window right here, which is called Pivot Center for Rotation Scaling. And if you click on it, the default setting is something called median point, which just means middle point. And it's the middle of the selection, which is what it is right now. So just remember, median point is the normal setting. What I want to change it to right now is called 3D cursor. And what that does is it changes it to wherever I left click and I put the 3D cursor, it will then rotate and scale around that point. So if I left click and I put the pivot point out here to the right of his head and I do rotate, check this out, look at that, it's rotating around that pivot point. And you can see that this is of course not what we want, but you can see it's rotating around that pivot point. So I'm going to press escape to get out of that. If I left click and put the pivot point at the top of his head and I rotate, you can see that he's rotating from the top center of his head. And of course I can change the area of influence of that circle by scaling, and it affects more vertices or less vertices. But again, all the action is happening from that point. So most of you have probably figured out that what we want now is you want to left click and put that pivot point at kind of the base center of his head. So now what I can do is I'm on frame 120 and I can go ahead and press R and rotate his head, and I can maybe scroll up that circle and I can change. So now I'm affecting his whole head, but I'm also affecting his shoulders a little bit, which gives a little bit more of a natural tilt. It's really quite cool and impressive that you can only select a handful of vertices, but you're actually affecting a whole bunch. And you can see here, this is kind of how I used to dance in middle school. So you can see we've got a nice natural tilt. Again, be very careful to watch for distortion and stretching and very unnatural. So I'm going to go ahead and left click and accept that, and I'm going to click on insert and see what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to tab out, and you can see now as I animate, he's going from natural to kind of tilting a little bit. And so he's got that there. And again, the action is happening from that pivot point now. Wherever I left click, it's happening from, which is pretty cool. So now you can do this with his hand too. So for instance, I would go back to frame 1. I would tab back into edit mode. I'm going to press A to deselect all. And if I wanted to animate his hand, I would go ahead and maybe I would press C to go into circle select mode, and maybe I would go ahead and brush over, some of the vertices that made up his arm. Okay, I'll press escape to get out of circle mode. And when you're thinking about where his arm would be animated from, if I was going to animate his arm rising up, I'd probably want to left click and put the 3D cursor there, about his elbow, because that's where we animate from. And so I would want to keyframe this position here. So I'll click on insert, and it creates a keyframe right there. Then maybe I'll go to frame 120, and on frame 120 maybe I'll press R to rotate. I'll decrease the size, and you can see that I'm moving his arm. It's also pulling on his waist, and you can see part of that is the circle, so I'll decrease the circle of influence. So that's working. It's working all right. I'm going to press escape. Maybe I'll put the pivot point here closer to his forearm, so now when I press R, you can see where it's happening from. So you're going to have to play around with it a little bit. to get the right pivot point. So R, and move it out a little bit. Maybe I don't want to rotate it at all. Maybe I just want to grab it and move it up and then rotate it a little bit. Decrease the circle of influence a little bit. Maybe you're gonna have to play around with it and decide. This arm is a little tricky, I will admit. It's trickier than the head and the neck. You might not want the pivot point. This might be an instance where you want to go back and change the pivot point back to median point. And so remember, the median point is the middle of whatever you have selected. So now you can press R and you can grab it, or you can rotate it, sorry, and then you can press G to grab it. So maybe that looks more natural, and his arm just rises up a little bit like that. And then I'll press Insert Keyframe, and there we go. I'll tab out, go back, I'll finish up, and you'll see his arm is animated and his head is animated. It looks like his head is not animating, so I'm not sure what's going on there. I'll have to try to figure that out. So I'll come back when I think I've got that figured out. Okay? Okay, so I'm back. So what I figured out is that the Animal add-on, you need to have all the vertices posed before you press Insert Keyframe. So I'm on frame 120, and I have his arm posed in the upward position. What I need to do now is I need to, I'm going to deselect all. I need to circle select the vertices for his head. I'm going to go back to 3D to the 3D cursor. Okay, so now I need to rotate his head and shoulders. There we go. Grab him a little bit. Okay, and now press Insert. Okay, so you can see that I needed to rotate his head, or change the position of the vertices of his head and shoulders and the arm at the same time. I was doing them separately. I'll tab out now. And now you can see his arm and his head are animating at the same time. So I'll go ahead and press play, and you can see now on the right in the camera animation view, you can see his arm and his head are moving at the same time. So in conclusion, again, it's not the best animation choice ever, but I've got camera animation and my subject is animated, and in your next image that you do, you can animate trees moving, people, certain objects. You have to really kind of understand the process to figure out what the limitations are. There are definitely limitations. There are certain kinds of physical actions you just can't do. Like, for instance, the reason why this doesn't work totally is that the kid's action is he's moving forwards. And so his arms are moving back and forth and his legs are moving back and forth because he's walking or running or skipping. And this type of animation, being really two-dimensional, doesn't really lend itself to this effect. But we can do a little bit of animation and still make it pretty cool. So I hope this helped you out, and I hope this made sense. Please contact me with any questions. Thanks, and good luck.